Hey, good day, folks. Welcome back to our Genesis class live from Jerusalem. But we don't have Rabbi Chaim Goldberg with us today, but instead we've got something great. We've got Rabbi Shmuel Herschler is going to do a wonderful lesson on the art of settling conflict. I look forward to hearing this. This is something that I could always integrate. There's always room for improvement on. You may just pick up one little issue that diffuses a situation. Who knows? I'm sure it'll be interesting. But let's just jump right in. Shalom, Rabbi Herschler. So glad that you're with us. I know you, like you just mentioned, you just finished your leaving the synagogue or something. But we're
That's
glad to
right.
have you with us. We're going to turn the class over to you. Take it away, Rabbi.
With great pleasure. Thank you so much, Chacham Dan, and we're ready to start. You know what? The art of conflict is something which has been existing since the very daybreak of history. Even prior to the sources that I've sent, the first two siblings in the world, Cain and Abel, had a dispute between them. We don't exactly know what the argument was directly from the text, but the fact of the matter is it ended up in a very grave way where Cain slay Abel. And according to various sources, they were, as you'd be unsurprised, they were fighting on financial leadership, or maybe on the wife, the woman, on Eve. Both of them were interested. Seems like marital life and financial competition has been something that the world has been going through since its very daybreak. And even siblings can get to rivalry related to this kind of thing. This has been the reality of history from the very beginning. And I know you learned with Rabbi Goldberg a whole lot of Genesis, and just give you a snapshot of some ideas which you have already learned. Therefore, I didn't want to trouble in bringing the sources from Genesis, which you're more familiar with. But I'll give you a couple of ideas that relate to this idea. So first of all, the first sibling rivalry in the world was either on a financial level or on marital life of both Cain or Abel, either with Eve or a potential sister if they may have had. There are traditions that together with Cain and Abel, three girls were born. It's been learned from Genesis 4. There it mentions that she continued to bear, this is talking about Eve, she bare both Cain and Abel. And the Bible doesn't usually add superfluous statements. So to mention Cain and Abel, the tradition is that Cain was born with one twin sister and Abel with two. To make your life simple, Adam and Eve had 5 children according to that tradition, 2 sons and 3 daughters. And it could be there was some sibling rivalry between Cain and Abel, who would marry whom. There weren't other women in the world other than their siblings. And this also was a source of conflict, like financial. Not so many years later, when Abraham already is around, I'm skipping a little bit purposely, and he has a nephew by the name of Lot. Lot is the son of Abraham's brother. And there seems to be in Genesis 13, there's a famous debate between the shepherds of Abraham and the shepherds of Lot. Now, Abraham makes a clear differentiation between the ethical side and the family responsibility. And he says in his words to Lot, let there not be a fight and a quarrel between us. If you want to turn to the left, which means you want to move north, I will go to the south. If you want to go to the south, I'll move to the north. But as they would say in Hebrew, translated to English, let's part as friends. In other words, we will still be related. We'll be brethren. I'll be your uncle and you'll be my nephew. But I'd rather live a little bit away from you. I think there's a well-known saying in general literature that if you want to maintain friendship, often it's a good idea to live a little bit apart of your close friends. Because if you see them all the time, you have a tend to fight. You never fight with your wife, of course, but I'm saying when you speak with other people, I see her smiling. I agree with you, Mike. It sometimes happens, I believe, but let's assume that it rarely happens. In any event, I'm trying to be a little bit smiling also while talking. But to the same level, if you want to maintain friendship between people to see them every day, is not necessarily a good idea. When you meet each other in parties or trips every few weeks or every few months, you tend to maintain a lot better of a relationship. So Abraham sees that Lot's shepherds are not on the ethical standard that for Abraham was reasonable, and he said to him, let's separate as friends. According to rabbinical tradition, what happened was that Lot's shepherds started to roam and graze in Abraham's fields, and they actually had, believe it or not, Dan, they even had a legal claim in their favor. What were they saying? Abraham and his wife are childless, and our father, Lot's father, had died already. So we are the natural heirs of Abraham's property. And whatever he has there, all his fields are going to move to me very soon. And I must tell you that Abraham at that stage was not a spring chicken at all. He was in his late 80s already. And therefore, Lot had reason to think that within a few years, he would be naturally inheriting Abraham's land. So he claimed this was not theft because he was grazing in property that eventually is going to become his. Of course, that's nonsense because until a person passes away from this world, he legally owns all of his belongings unless he personally authorizes otherwise. But Lot wanted to take advantage of the history as it seemed unreasonable that Abraham and Sarah would have children in their late 80s, early 90s, which eventually, as you know, didn't happen that way anyhow, but that was his thinking. The next case of sibling rivalry, all this you know from Genesis, just to give you how often this happens, is between two siblings, both of Abraham's kids, Ishmael and Isaac. Although they didn't have the same mother, but they shared the same father. And Sarah makes it very clear in Genesis 21 that I am not prepared for Ishmael to inherit with my son Isaac, not because she was concerned financially so much as she was concerned about the attitude and livelihood that Ishmael had chosen for himself, becoming a hunter with arrows and shooting. That wasn't exactly the cup of tea that Sarah was keen with. And on top of it, Hagar, who had Ishmael as her son, was an Egyptian woman with an Egyptian culture, not exactly what Sarah had good memories from. As you recall, when Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 12 went to Egypt because of a famine, Sarah was almost taken advantage of by Pharaoh, and eventually they left the country. I'm sure she didn't have pleasant memories from there. Hagar, although did bring life into Abraham's home by having a baby, but the culture that Ishmael originated from was definitely not Sarah's cup of tea. And we mentioned, by the way, in one of the recent sessions on Sunday, that one of the problems with Muslims, forgive me, is that religion, basically, this is a reality. In Africa, for sure, and I worked a couple of years in Africa, but not only there, in other parts of Europe also, part of the huge expansion of the Islam religion, a very high percentage of it, relates to battles and sword and warfare, which has been going on for generations. The fact that there are 1.6 billion of them today in the world, a lot of it came through force and to a certain extent, even till this day and age. And this originates all the way back to Genesis 16, when Ishmael was born for the first time, and the angel says to Hagar that you're going to have a wild child that's going to be born. He's going to live in the desert, and he will try to take anything that's available. Okay, so as you see, that sibling rivalry was finalized by the fact that Ishmael moved to Egypt and Isaac remained in the Holy Land. And thank goodness that separation at least worked for a reasonable amount of time. Eventually, when Abraham died, both Ishmael and Isaac together buried him. And although Isaac was 14 years younger than Ishmael, as mentioned in the Torah, Isaac was given the right to be the main officiator at his father's burial. So Ishmael did somewhat improve in his behavior. Later on, it's no secret at all that Isaac's children, also Jacob and Esau, had quite a bit of sibling rivalry. There was much worse. When Jacob gets the firstborn rights, Esau says, well, I'll wait till my father dies because I have respect for him. But once he goes, I will take care of and get rid of my brother Jacob. And as a result, his mother, Rebecca, sends Jacob to her brother, knowing that her brother Laban is not exactly her cup of tea either. He's not a very honest person financially and in other ways. But in the meantime, as they say in English, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm always appreciative if I use an English expression which you're less common with or don't associate with. Rebecca is saying to Jacob, cut your losses, please. I know that my brother is not necessarily your cup of tea either, but your brother wants to kill you, and in the meantime, you will find safeguard at my brother's house. Isaac, who agrees with his wife, Rebecca, that Jacob should leave the home, he gives another agenda, though, why Jacob should leave the house. Not because he should be scared of sibling rivalry that his brother Esau will actually kill him, but rather it's about time for Jacob to get married, to have a wife, and to have children. And Jacob was a man of over 60 years old before he got married for the first time. And therefore, it was clearly about time for him to start developing a family. It was definitely on time. By the way, if you happen to work it out, does anybody in this group know how old Jacob was when Joseph, his son, was born? That can be figured out from the Bible itself. If you don't know, I'll give you it as a nice little riddle for today. I used to like as a young child arithmetic, and I hope it's okay with you. But this is written directly in the Bible. In Genesis 47, when Jacob gets to Egypt, Pharaoh asks Jacob, how old are you? In Arabic, he asked him, Adesh Umrak, if you want to speak it in the original language. And Jacob said that I'm 130 years old. It does mention in Genesis 41 that Joseph was 30 years old when he became the viceroy in Egypt. And when his brothers eventually came to Egypt during the famine, he mentions that there will be, as he solves Pharaoh's dream, there'll be 7 years of plentiful, and then there'll be a famine for 7 years. So I just take the numbers again. He was 30 years old when he started, and that he got the job because he solved Pharaoh's dream and offered a solution. And indeed, there were 7 years of plentiful and then 7 years of famine. But it does mention in Genesis 45 that when his siblings and father came to Egypt, he says there's already 2 years of famine now, and it's going to carry on for another 5 years. Namely, if there were 7 years of plentiful, and then there were 2 years so far of famine, that means that Joe has been the boss in Egypt, the viceroy, for 9 years, meaning that he was 39 years old when his siblings arrived and his dad. So if his father was asked by the king of Egypt about his age being 130, it's easy to figure out that Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. Because if Joseph was 39 and Jacob was 130, you don't need a calculator. The people who attend this lecture today, kids who are 10 years old can't even figure out how much is 50 minus 30. But your age group, like mine, in our days, we still learned how to do plus and minus, even without a calculator. So you can see the gap between them was over 90 years of age. In any event, so Isaac says to Jacob, under very certain terms, sir, you are going to find a wife amongst Laban's daughters. Eventually, he married both of them. Leah and Rachel are both daughters of Laban, and he married both, and that's how the tribes of Israel emerged. But to cut the story short, because I'm talking about conflict and trying to solve, so Abraham said to Lot, separate. Ishmael was separated by Sarah, who said, to Abraham, send Ishmael away, and Isaac will stay with us. Jacob and Esau, they eventually lived in different places, and also Rebekah and Isaac find for Jacob a place to go to. And by the time he gets back to Israel, Jacob, many years later, Esau already moved to the Seir mountain. But the biggest challenge are amongst Jacob's children themselves. As we know, we have there quite a difficulty between Joseph and his brothers, and also what ended up being the solution there, that Joseph was sent away, this time to Egypt, but not by his father, like in the case of Ishmael, by his brothers who sell him to the Egyptians. And that's how that conflict, so to speak, comes to I would say almost to an end, but not completely. Because although Joseph actually gained out of the sale, and starting off as a servant, and within a decade he becomes the viceroy of the largest country at the time, but I can't really say that the tension between the boys and the brothers there had ended while Jacob was still living. Not very clear that there was that much peace between them in the meantime. And now I'm asking myself, or asking you, what could have been a solution to this conflict between Joseph and his brothers in a way that would be more suitable in solving conflicts? In order to give us, we can think of perhaps of two major perspectives. Joseph becomes a very important person in Egypt, becomes the viceroy, almost like more than a vice president of the United States of today by far, somebody, a very, very important individual. His brothers are also important in their own right. They belong and are growing in a very noble family, but most of their involvement and growth would be internal rather than external. In other words, they would be the source of the Judaic and the Hebrew life in general, because they were living the entire period in an insulated environment by their father Jacob, who was a very righteous person. Although Joseph became a world leader, but he wasn't living amongst the most decent people. The Egyptians in general, and Pharaoh in particular, were not known to be the most noble people on earth. And he was living in a society which was clearly different than the ethics and goals that he was taught in his home and back in Canaan. Whereas his brothers were credited to live with their father and his ethics their entire period until they built up their own families. It's quite a different situation than Joseph. As a matter of fact, even when Jacob eventually hears, when he didn't know eventually and didn't know originally, that Joseph was still living and that he became a big leader in Egypt, if you happen to remember from your education, Jacob was not totally impressed in the beginning. On the one hand, he loved his son very much, and the Torah mentions that in Genesis 37. But that doesn't mean that he was sure that he would meet the Joseph that he had educated in his home years ago. Don't forget, Joseph leaves his house when he's 17 years old, and his father meets him, as I mentioned earlier, when he's already 39. That's more than 20 years had gone by, and a very critical period past adolescence, when he's maturing and growing and living in a distant land which is hostile to the ethics that he was brought up in his home. And Jacob was happy on the one hand that his son was living, but he was really asking himself, is that the son I have trained? Is that the son I have raised? Who is his wife? Who are his children? Are they following the legacy that I have had throughout my life? And this is a serious question that Jacob asks, only when he sees that Joseph's children carry on the tradition that they learned in his home, he started to become proud. And he said, and this became a Jewish custom, by the way, for the last 3 millennia, that every Friday night we bless our sons and daughters sons to be like Joseph's kids, Ephraim and Manasseh, and the girls also by the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. We always bless them to follow our matriarchs and Joseph's sons. And one of the great scholars, by the way, said something very nice about this. Why, of all people that we address our blessing, do we mention that our children should be like Joseph's sons? And he said something which is so true in the course of our history. Because the plight of the Hebrew nation for such a long time has been outside of Palestine, outside of the Holy Land, outside of Israel, and yet we were able to maintain our religiosity in so many countries of the diaspora. Jacob is blessing his future descendants that wherever they shall live, they should learn that even in Egypt you can survive as a proper Jew, and this would be true wherever you were to go to. However, as I'm suggesting, the sorting out of the conflict was not complete. Although Joseph did help his brothers and support them in Egypt, and they all buried their father together in Canaan, but to say that the relationship within the home there was perfect, it's a little bit hard to say this. Where did the change begin? Change began in early Exodus when we discover that Aaron is 3 years older than Moses, and Moses becomes the prime leader, and Aaron has no second thoughts and rivalry towards Moses. To the contrary, God tells Moses that Aaron is going to go and see you, and he is so happy in his heart that you became the national leader. He doesn't have any grudge that although you are 3 years younger than him, you are getting ahead of him, and he's very happy with that. Not too many people could act like that when it comes to potential sibling rivalry. And now with my gratefulness towards Rav Dan for putting out the sources, please put out number 16, which happens to be in this portion of the week. And we will see what actually happens when Moses already is a well-known leader. The Hebrews were taken out of Egypt. The revelation already occurred. And this happens to be the portion this coming week. Would you kindly read some of the sources over there in the beginning of chapter 16 of Numbers? It'll be of great help.
All right, Numbers chapter 16, verse 1. Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, took himself to one side, along with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, descendants of Reuben.
Reuben is the oldest son of Jacob, of course, yes.
Right. They confronted Moses together with 250 men from the children of Israel, chieftains of the congregation, representatives of the assembly, men of repute. They assembled against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much upon yourselves, for the entire congregation are all holy, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you raise yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" And Moses heard and fell on his face. He spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, "In the morning the Lord will make known who is his and who is holy, and he will draw them near to him, and the ones he chooses he will draw near to him. Do this, Korah and his company, take for yourselves censers. Place fire into them and put incense upon them before the Lord tomorrow, and the man whom the Lord chooses, he is the Holy One. You have taken too much upon yourselves, sons of Levi." Verse 8, Moses said to Korah, "Please listen, sons of Levi." 9, it is not enough that the God of Israel has distinguished you from the congregation of Israel to draw you near to him, to perform the service in the Mishkan of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them. He drew near you and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you, and now you seek the kahuna as well. 11, therefore, you and your entire company who are assembled are against the Lord. For what is Aaron that you should complain against him? 12. Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not go up." 13. Is it not enough that you have brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the desert, that you should also exercise authority over us?
Okay, let's take a break at this stage.
Okay.
Pretty heavy stuff, right? You got the leader of the Jewish people, took them out of Egypt, splitting of the Red Sea, Revelation, already have the tribal division, on the way to Palestine, and before anything moves on further, you got these group of people that challenge the leadership, claiming that these two
almost a mutiny.
men, sorry?
Almost a mutiny.
Absolutely. What do we do with this? So what does Moses say? Go ahead and bring in incense. This way you'll figure out what? You'll figure out that the choice that we became the two leaders was not our choice. This was a divine decision, nothing to do with any nepotism that we share in our family, nothing that we chose on our own to make. And if God will respond to the incense, then it proves that he has chosen. Why does Moses choose this pattern in order to determine the righteousness and the justifying him being the leader? Why couldn't he think of a more mediating type of discussion? By the way, with Dathan and Abiram, it seems like that's what he was saying. Please come. And they said, we're not going to come. And you read so nicely, but when you read verse 13, how many of you noticed that they said, is not enough that you brought us out of a land flourishing with milk and honey? This is what you call in English plain demagoguery. The land of Israel is the land that's meant to be flourishing of milk and honey. The last thing you can say about Egypt, certainly in the time when the Hebrews were enslaved there for over 2 centuries, to say that that land was flourishing with milk and honey for the Hebrews and the other nations living there at the time, that's what they would call in England absolute rubbish. But the nature of demagoguery is that you take statements out of context and you give them a new meaning. And if you're not careful in listening to the demagoguery as it goes through and using various types of charisma that Korah definitely had, then you don't even realize what the person is saying. I mean, to say that Moses and Aaron have a very high percentage of leadership, that could be a valid argument. But to come up with nonsense as if Egypt was a land flourishing of milk and honey, that's only because once you start to develop a criticism that's unlimited, like you said, a mutiny, you don't know where this is going to go, where this is going to take you. Moses is telling the Levites, listen, you guys were already chosen by God to be relatively above your other tribal competitors. And why is it Levi was not the oldest son of Jacob? He's the third son, not the first. And why was he given the priority? Because they were not involved in the golden calf sin. They were not involved in idolatry, which is something we're so much as Bnei Noach trying to fight against paganism. The only tribe that was not involved in paganism at all were the Levites. And that's why they were chosen to do the work in the sanctuary, because they were the only ones who were befitting to go in and do so. In the not such brief summary, but overall description that I brought you from Genesis, one of the things that comes up there in all the stories is that the younger is more successful than the senior. Abel is younger than Cain, and he was more righteous, and Cain killed him. Isaac is 14 years younger than Ishmael, as mentioned in the Torah, and Esau was older than Jacob, and Joseph was younger than most of his brothers. The whole Genesis is talking about the younger person doing better than the older by birth. The message being conveyed clearly is that the biological age does not determine necessarily seniority in ethics and in values. Consequently, the fact that Moses and Aaron are not necessarily the oldest in their own family, it doesn't mean that they're not senior in all levels of behavior. And when people start going for a mutiny and demagoguery, they're willing to come up with ideas which are simply impossible. Now, why does Moses go for fire and for incense? Not, God forbid, in order to kill anybody, because later on Aaron goes with an incense in broad area where people were all around and nobody got hurt at all. The idea is simple. The problem with this mutiny is not a political question only, or not even the main thing, who's going to be the Israelite leader. What they were challenging is the validity of the Torah given by Moses. Because if some of the ideas that Moses was bringing forward was to promote himself personally, that challenge is the validity of the Torah being true. And therefore Moses says, listen, if you people have any challenge, not of me, but as if the 613 commandments or whatever was given at the revelation is authentic, let's go back to the source who commanded. The source who commanded you and commanded me was God at the same mountain where all these people now complaining had assembled. Don't forget, this whole story is only about a year and 3 months after the revelation. All the people complaining over here, 250 people, were all there. They know what Moses is talking about. No problem. You challenge that I had instructions to go in and do this. Go in and bring a fire to God to appeal to his mercy and to his message, and we'll see who he appeals to. When you bring a fire that's not in place, like my own nephews, Aaron's sons, 2 of them brought an incense that caused their death. They were not chosen to do so. You can't make these decisions on your own, because who is going to lead the Israelite people, and for that matter, other countries as well, is essentially a divine decision. And therefore, Moses says, if it were just politics, we would have a table trying to sit together. Look, if Dathan and Abiram are not even willing to sit and speak. But if you challenge that leadership, so let's go back to the source and ask God who is right. However, Chacham Dan, if you move back to the original on chapter 16, I think it's verse number 3, you want to look back again. There's one thing that Korah said that definitely does make sense, and that happens. In verse 3. You want to read verse 3 again?
It says, they assembled against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for the entire congregation are all holy, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you raise yourselves above the Lord's assembly?
Now, this is not totally wrong. Matter of fact, there's a lot of wisdom in this. As I mentioned, at the revelation itself in Exodus 19, it does mention that the congregation of Israel will be God's kingdom and holy nation. And Korah is saying that if we are all part of that covenant and all heard it together, there is no room for people to be superior to us, because everybody are that way. Now, there's only one loophole which is problematic with the statement. This is all true provided what? That you keep all what God had said. That we are a chosen people is fine, but we are chosen in order to follow the word of God, and that we are committed entirely to do it. Now, it could be, I want to make a very fine but a very important distinction, which is most relevant today. I am totally aware that there are plenty of Jews and non-Jews who are not totally observant in the religion that they themselves believe in principle. And I'm not the one to judge other people. I hope I do my best to be a good person myself, which is the most important thing from my perspective. But if a person believes in principle, in God, and believes completely in God, and sometimes makes mistakes, but hasn't changed their general belief, that's perfectly in place, as long as you belong to the covenant and you accept it to be something that commits you. What Korah and his gang were doing were challenging the authenticity of the Torah message of Moses. And every Hebrew child is meant from his very young age to utter Torah was given us by Moses, and that's the legacy of the people of Jacob. So if you challenge Moses on the commandments, you are basically uprooting the Torah. That's essentially what happened with Christianity. In the beginning, Jesus was trying to make things a bit easier. By the time they got to Paul, they already threw out almost everything. So this is something so fundamental, and it's easy to get to the feeling that if things are not going as perfect as we would like at the time of the revelation, so as they would say in Hebrew, translated to English, it's either everything or nothing. No ways, gentlemen and ladies. No ways. We believe that there's a lot in between. If you strongly believe in the mission of God, even if you are not able at this particular moment in time on June 11th, 2023, to get everything the way you'd like it to be done in perfection, that doesn't mean that you should feel inferior, as long as you believe in the mission. If you want to move, please, into Samuel 1, I want to bring a couple of verses from there also, which I sent out, which highlight that from a different perspective.
Okay.
Would you like to read there, starting from verse 3?
Chapter 8?
Yeah, chapter 8. You can read the first 3 verses also.
1 Samuel chapter 8, starting at verse 1, it says, And it was when Samuel had grown old that he appointed his sons judges in Israel, and the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. And his sons did not walk in his ways, and they turned after gain, and they took bribes and perverted justice. And all the elders of Israel gathered and came to Samuel to Ramah, and they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now set up for us a king to judge us like all the nations. And the thing was displeasing in the eyes of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people according to all that they will say to you, for they have not rejected you, but have rejected me from reigning over them, like all the deeds which they have done from the day I brought them up from Egypt and until this day, and they forsook me and served other gods, so are they doing to you. And now listen to their voice, except that you shall warn them and tell them the manner of the king who will reign over them.
Let's take a break.
Samuel related all the words of the Lord to the people who asked of him a king.
Okay, so let's take a break over here. Basically, thank you so much. The people appeal to Samuel and say, in simple terms, Sir, you were excellent, but you don't have a follow-up. Your sons are not following the way you did. They didn't want to say things so directly in a negative way. Now is the time to appoint a king. And Samuel seems to be upset. And God says, listen to them and appoint a king. And don't think it's something personally towards you. It is actually towards me. How do you understand that? I mean, if Samuel's sons were not acting in a very decent way, why is this request problematic? I mean, there is a leadership crisis. So it's not legitimate in a situation like that to look for a change? What do you think happened? What's fascinating to find is, I'm not going to take your time, it's getting a bit late, but I want to give you a nice lecture today. If you have time at home, if you have a full Bible, look in 1 Chronicles, chapters 5 and 6, and you find the descendants of the tribe of Levi. which Moses and Aaron belonged to, and Korah, all from Levi. It ends up that Samuel is a direct descendant of them. And it seems like the same argument that Korah brought forward is what they're actually dealing with now. Namely, if all the congregation were at the revelation and we're all a holy nation, let us determine the means of leadership ourselves. And God says to Samuel, you know what? Politics, I don't give you directive what type of legislation you shall have. What counts is, do you follow the message of God or you don't follow the message of God? What he was saying is they rejected me. They're not rejecting you because since they left Egypt, many times they were involved with paganism. And if the people are not following the ways of the Lord, then we can try another type of leadership. But why is this king something which is contradictory and somewhat of a rivalry towards God? Because God is the king of Israel and the king of the world as a whole. And why should there be a necessity to have a king of blood and flesh, a physical king, when there is already a divine king? The idea seems to be problematic. And if it is problematic, why does God say to Samuel to listen to them anyhow? And this is a very important point. The means of legislation is not the make or break. There are times where, and I hope today democracy, as Churchill said, it's the lousiest method, but the only one that works. So we have to follow what today actually could work, even if it's not ideal. And there were times, and there's still some countries like Spain, Jordan, a couple others, which still have a real monarchy. I don't mean with all due respect to Charles III, it's not really a monarchy, England of today. But in Spain and in Jordan and in a few countries, there's still a king who is the political leader as well, who makes the main decisions. In any event, Judaism does not jubilize the idea of a monarchy, but it doesn't rule out the option either. The question is whether we are seeking to become close to God. So when we're coming to try to settle conflicts between us, number one, you have to determine what is the goal that needs to be found in the conflict between the parties that are debating. I had a phone call 2 hours ago. Listen, as a rabbi, I get questions of a couple that are getting divorced. And it's sad, they got 3 kids already, what to handle. Instead of trying to figure out what would be the best for their children, they're fighting on money between them. What a terrible thing. Instead of thinking about such a wonderful blessing God gave them with 3 children who are ready and past high school, could be proud of them and making a project together, this is what they're doing. You always have to figure out when there's a conflict, where is the mutual goal? Where are the things that you can agree upon? And to try to use that conflict as a source of growth. Eventually, when Abraham parts from Lot, the Hebrew people develop. When Isaac is separated from Ishmael, the Jewish people move on. And certainly when Jacob goes and builds up his family with his 2 wives, that's where the whole house of Israel came from. And essentially, even this conflict in the time of Samuel, it didn't work well in his time, because in the early part, because Saul was not a successful king. But David, relatively speaking, was the best king Israel ever had, and he was anointed by Samuel later on. So sometimes even things that in the short term do not seem to be ideal, don't lose hope because of that. Part of the solving of conflict is to have a perspective towards the future. When we find something that you can work together despite the conflict and focus on that, you'll eventually be able to tackle the other part as well. But if the whole time you're getting into demagoguery and turning Egypt into a country flourishing in milk and honey and looking for the evil and the mutiny, as Chacham mentioned earlier, then you're looking for trouble. As long as there is a mission together that we are seeking, given modern Israel today, you all know from the news that there's somewhat of a clash between the opposition and the coalition. But if you look at the mutual achievement of 75 years of independence and being able to build up a wonderful place in a hostile Middle East. And that's something that we all share together. That's also a way to try to deal with a conflict in a positive way. And the United States and many other countries which have been proud to have a democracy for over 2 centuries, despite all the troubles, there's a lot of good things that are done, and we should try to focus on the positive, not because we bypass the negative, but it makes the conflict much easier to tackle when you talk about the mutual future as well. I want to open the floor to you. I've spoken a little bit a long time, but I wanted to get somewhat of a firm message across, and now you're welcome to say whatever you'd like. Please.
Rabbi, I really liked how you brought out the point about don't take it personally, because that is the surest way to escalate any feud. When somebody's saying or doing something that you think is derogatory, once you take it personally and respond, that tends to like put a match to the straw, and yeah.
Very much so. Yes, Mike.
Yes, Rabbi. Wouldn't the reference to Egypt being the land of milk and honey be a reference to the fact that they were in the desert and had the strictures of a very harsh life at that time, and they hankered back for when they were fed and watered, the easy life?
What you're saying is very precious and meaningful in the sense that part of the reason, I didn't even go into that, part of the reason that Korach got involved now is because the spies that gave a negative report about Israel, it caused the Hebrews to remain in the desert for a long time. And what you're saying is that although Egypt is not exactly a country of flourishing of milk and honey, but when you're in a situation which is worse, so to speak, or the way you feel it, you start to have pleasant memories, even about things that you didn't particularly like at the time. You know what? I'll give you a sweet example. We had 2 years after I finished high school, or 3 years later, there was a gathering of the people who finished school together, and we met our class teacher. And he said, "What do you guys feel today about what happened?" One of the fellows who became a lawyer later on, not surprisingly, said, "Rabbi, that we don't feel any negative feelings today because we're older doesn't mean it was easy for us." What he actually said was true. People have a tendency with nostalgia to say years ago everything was great. But when we were 15 and 16 years old, we didn't see it that way. When we became 20 years old already, our perspective about what was before was glorious. But that doesn't mean we felt that way at the time. Small kids complain about things that we think today are nonsense. But for them, it may mean a lot, even though we see things in a different way. I'm supporting what you're saying.
Yes. Also, Rabbi, the tactics of the rebellious, if you want to say, like, this is a mutiny case, they will always try to cite some sort of validity for their position. And for them to call the land a land of milk and honey was to say at least they had sustenance there. And it was a complaint. And point being, I find that when you're dealing with conflict, whoever's actually instigating the conflict, they always try to grab on to something to give it a degree of validity rather than just be a blatant confrontation like in Israel, if somebody's heaven forbid doing a bombing, right, a lot of times terrorist attacks are just blatant in your face, but when somebody's doing a mutiny or a derogatory, they're always trying to cite something that validates their justification for the conflict.
Absolutely.
Very good point, though, Mike. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, James.
Good morning or good evening. Okay. This is not to be contentious, In my heart, I have love for knowledge, and so I want to ask a question I hope that you could speak to, Rabbi. And this is what I've learned through research. How is it that there is no archaeological evidence of the Israelites living in the desert for that length of time? And this is what the experts are sharing with us, that there's no evidence archaeologically that they were there. What that many people are saying, there should have been something. How would you speak to that, Rabbi?
Well, I'll say the following. There is some evidence in the Sinai Desert of presence of a large group of people. Certainly, as you say, not necessarily the numbers that are quoted in the Bible directly. But I think, with due respect, when you're talking about religious behavior, there is some dimension to faith which is purposely left to our thinking. In other words, if everything were to be 200% obvious, it wouldn't really be an act of religion. It would be just a gathering of historical facts and events. There are dimensions of things that, in the course of history, at different times are highlighted in a different way. Let's put it this way. If the archaeology in the course of the last 3 millennia were very religious orientated in their actions, and it doesn't matter which denomination, then I think more hints would be found in the land of Israel today. There are numerous archaeological findings of historical things that occurred during biblical times. It's true that the actual period in the desert, which, by the way, was only for 40 years, think about even the smallest number today talks about a world that is almost 5,800 years of age. So what is 40 years out of 5,800 years of human civilization? It's less than 1% of world history. I don't know how much of a trace of that would be completely expected. You had in Europe wars that went on for 70 years, 30-year conflicts. If you look in the perspective of history about those conflicts, and some of them were in the 16th, 17th century and beyond, you'd expect that there would be somewhat of a mark still noticeable. I mean, we know it because it's much closer in history to our period of time. But it doesn't mean that in every world conflict, especially in the course of time that goes by, are there always remnants and historical recollections of what's going on. And I'll tell you one thing beyond that also. During the 40-year period that the Hebrews were in the desert, there wasn't that much, there wasn't that much of physical activity that the Hebrews were doing. They were basically more than, even in rabbinical tradition, 20 out of the 40 years, they were more or less in the same area. And in any event, their movement was not tremendous. The whole distance they went in those 40 years is a distance, and by walking would have taken less than 2 weeks if it was possible politically to make that move. The difficulty is only because traditionally we had a large number of Hebrews already then, over 600,000. And like you're saying, James, with a huge number like that, you would expect more archaeological evidence. But I'm going to summarize my comment and say, number one, religion always leaves a little bit for faith. And secondly, the amount of activity that was going on, there weren't many wars during this period, there wasn't much movement. If not for the fact that in religion, that period was a very important period of growth in the internal sense of the story, it didn't have that many ramifications or world history in the short term. And if the Bible would not highlight that period in particular, I don't know if we would have taken it that long. Just to give you one example, I was teaching today the second part from Samuel 1. Judges, which is the Bible story before Samuel, covers 350 years. And the amount of time that it covers doesn't take up half as much as periods later on that are only 20 or 30 years. Sometimes historical periods, some of them are very, very eventful, and others don't play so much of a dramatic period like others. That's what life is like. Take between the beginning of the First World War and the end of the Second World War. Between 1914 and 1945, you're talking about less than 31 years, where over 100 million people lost their lives between the two wars. 100 million people, including civilians, between the two wars. How many periods beforehand were so vicious in history like those 30 years? What can I tell you?
Yeah, exactly, Rabbi. Exactly, for sure. I mean, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the nuclear bombs were. I mean, they rebuilt those cities. I mean, but I mean, I understand, and I've gone through a lot of the similar dilemma that James mentioned, looking for tangible evidence, tangible facts. I found when it comes to looking at evidence for the Hebrew people in the land of Egypt and whatnot, Dr. David Roll, British archaeologist Dr. David Roll, has some beautiful, beautiful material. I'm friends with him on Facebook, and I've got a few of his videos, James. He's just got some beautiful, beautiful material, especially for the Hebrew people. Like he's literally showcased, uncovered the archaeological evidence for Joseph's palace in Egypt and all around the land of Avaras, and the historical record does show that the land of Avaras, which was Goshen, I mentioned in the Bible, but there is it vacated. It became emptied and then reused at a later period, and there is room archaeologically for evidence of the leaving of the Exodus. But then again, what else does when it comes to the Sinai Peninsula, you're dealing with a big area, and from what I understand, there is a certain area that's under a political blockade currently. And I really like how Rabbi Herschler brought that out today when he mentioned when they asked for a king, and then he talked about the states or the countries today that still have reigning monarchs as monarchy, and he likened the difference with the UK. Even though Charles is king there, their monarchy does not function like a full monarchy. They have democracy there, and so political structure plays a big factor. Rabbi, Kimberly in the group there has asked a question in the chat. I'll just read it to you. She says, the sibling rivalry. Did you read it?
Yeah.
Oh,
she wrote
okay,
there about the Teraphim of Rachel mentioned over there. That actually occurred a bit later. That's when Jacob was actually escaping from Laban on his way to the land of Canaan. And she takes what her father had been using in his eyes as something which was partially paganist. And one of the questions which troubled our sources as well was she actually taking something that was idolatry. The common attitude is, by the way, not only by religious circles, as that what he had, believe it or not, was something which is similar to what you'd call today a GPS or somewhat of one of these Waze or navigation ideas, because she was apprehensive that Laban would figure out the route that Jacob was escaping with. And that's why she took it, because she had a feeling that that would help Laban chase after them and put them into trouble. That doesn't necessarily mean that that was the correct thing, because by thinking that this navigation thing would actually cause trouble is giving it importance. And of course, from a level of faith in God, it may not have been totally necessary for her to do so. But she was brought up in a home of that nature where she saw these things happening. And even if I'm not saying that she was a paganist herself, but there were things that people believed, like in astrology and navigating type of things and sundials, that she was concerned that they would be caught. And that's why she decided to take it with her. But your question is right. It's something that the rabbis actually criticized her for doing this, although they understood why she was doing it. When a person is in a field of apprehensive of danger, he doesn't always take all the nitty-gritty details properly, and it would have been better if she wouldn't have taken it. That's true. I agree. It's interesting. If you want,
Wow.
I can, in an opportunity, send you some sources that deal with this point. I'm sure you can find them in rabbinical literature about this Truffin issue, that it was like a navigating thing, and she shouldn't have been too apprehensive, although we understand what she was doing.
Well, there you go. I hope that helps answer your question, Kimberly. I also want to give a shout out. I see we got our friend Travis Cox with us here today. I haven't seen him with us for a while. Travis, so good to have you with us. How have you been?
Not well. I've been going through some health things. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, but I got no camera.
Okay. Well, I don't know what's up with the camera.
Well, it's good to see you again, my friend. It's been a while, and we missed you, and we wish you health and.
Well, I'm getting better. Hashem has his way. We go through things, and if you go 40 days without some kind of strife or trivia, then he's give up on you, right? Or either you're totally pure, right? So anyway. Just going through some things. I wanted to stop in. Sorry, my camera's not working. Say hello to everybody. I'm gonna try to start getting back here more often. They've changed my work hours again, so now maybe I'll be able to get back here. I really have missed it.
Just know how much you're appreciated. Your comments are always so well thought out and useful. And I just wanted to see if you've got your full beard back.
No. Actually, I have. I'm as clean shaven as you are right now.
Well, that's okay. We still care for you, and we've missed you, and it's just a joy to see you here today. I really appreciate Rabbi Herschler taking this class when Rabbi Goldberg said that he couldn't make it today. And the art of settling conflict is something that I find has always been a challenge in my life. I've been one of these people that can be maybe a little too easily provoked, and there's always room for improvement on. And I know that there's loads of stories in the Bible where things have just erupted, and yet it doesn't take away from the fact when you're provoked if you're easily triggered. And learning by trial and error is just not a pleasant way to live life, because there's always somebody who wants to provoke. Look at you. Good to see you, buddy.
Look great.
Good to see you. It's good to be here.
We're glad to have you.
My wife reads on.
Well, Rabbi Herschler, have you got any more to add, or before we are we going to wind it down, or does anybody else have any questions?
I want to express my gratefulness, first of all, to Dan for the sources, and I was also happy that we had a pretty nice participation. I admit I was slightly apprehensive because it's not the regular session, that maybe we wouldn't have as many, but I'm glad it worked, and I personally enjoyed preparing this as well, and I hope that we'll have more opportunities of this nature later on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's and like I said, it's good to have Travis back. We got Angela and Mike over in the UK, our friend Bart over in Europe. Byers is with us. Chantel is over in Europe as well. James, good to have you with us as always. Kimberly, and it's nice to see Lisette down in the Dominican Republic with us as well. Yeah, we hope all's well with you, Lisette. And well, if nobody else has got any more questions for the rabbi, shall we wind her down, Rabbi?
Thank you very much. Okay.
All right. So that's going to be our Genesis class for this week, which was held by Rabbi Shmuel Herschler on the art of settling conflict. It's something that I encourage everybody to always work on because when the opportunities present themselves, or when conflict presents itself, if you can diffuse the situation, it's always the wise thing to do. And you never want to escalate. But I find there's just so many people out there looking for conflict that it's tough to sidestep certain scenarios. But
seems like the animal's taking over out there, does it not?
Yeah, you don't want to give in to that for sure. But I'm so grateful to Rabbi Herschler for hosting this class today. So keep an eye posted for next week. I'll let you know. Rabbi Goldberg's going to call me tomorrow and we'll chat and make sure and find out if we're on for this week or not. So keep an eye on the posts on Facebook is where I post ads if we're going to go live. So till next time, have a wonderful, wonderful week,
Have a
everybody.
great
Bye
week.
for now.